Turner gave us when I came to town, he introduced me as the general manager as well as the color analyst on the games. He said I was like buying a suit with two pair of pants. And about a week later, I was in the Stadium Club having lunch with a member of the Braves front office who was in charge of all the radio broadcasts. And Turner walked through and he said to the guy, I was sitting there, didn't even acknowledge me. He said to the guy, so how are things going with the Braves in the radio? And the guy told him, he said, and the Hawks. And he says, well, they got this and that going on, and they got this sold and that. And he said, and the Cougars? And the guy said, who? He said, the Cougars. And the guy said, you mean the Chiefs? And he said, oh, yeah, whatever. And then he stuck his hand out to me and he said, hi, I'm Ted Turner. I mean, he had forgotten me in a week and he called the team the Cougars. So Ted had a great vision for the team and having it on television, but he was not a guy for great detail at the time.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey gang, Tim Hanlon here, as advertised. Thanks for joining me here on Good Seats Still Available, that curious little podcast that's focused on what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for joining us. If you're a first-time listener, come right in and join us. Put your earbuds in place and join us in our little journey together. If you're a repeat visitor, we apologize, but we do thank you for coming back to the podcast. Today's episode is an intriguing one and a fun one too. For those in the southeastern part of the country, in particular Charlotte, North Carolina, where the show's been around for a while, you'll know Terry Hanson as one of the many voices of the frivolity known as The Big Show with John Boy and Billy, a longtime staple in Charlotte and southeastern radio for many years. But most people don't recognize that Terry got his start in his Renaissance-like career in media and sports with various teams in the old North American Soccer League, and that's what we're focused on in our chat with Terry today. In particular, three legacy franchises that all have interesting memories attached to them: the Rochester Lancers of the mid-1970s NASL, the Washington Diplomats, certainly in the latter part of the 70s, and then perhaps most famously for Terry, his role as general manager under then owner Ted Turner and the fledgling Turner Sports and Turner Media Enterprise, the Atlanta Chiefs, the reborn Atlanta Chiefs that ran in Atlanta from 79 through 81. Some very interesting, remarkable, and perhaps wince-inducing stories to be heard in a few minutes from our friend and our interview subject today, Terry Hanson, here on the show in just a couple of seconds. Before we get to Terry and those memories of the old NASL, I do want to remind you that our friends at Audible have been kind enough to give us a sponsorship shot. And if you'd like to show some love for the show, we highly encourage you to give Audible a try through our little link here to try out their services. As you probably know by now, and if you don't, shame on you, Audible is the premier provider of digital audiobooks, and they have over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre that you can imagine, whether it be in comedy or sci-fi or business or romance. Tons of great nonfiction stuff, nonfiction books and sports books, nonfiction sports in particular. Audible titles, he says, without mincing words, play on just about any device that you can think of, whether that be an iPhone, a Kindle, an Android device. According to Audible, it's over 500 devices and counting now that will ensure that you can listen to your audiobooks anytime and anywhere. And as I've hinted, that free trial and that free audiobook download, two free things to try, can be found at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats to get your free 30-day trial and a free audiobook download from Audible. We encourage you to try it. We thank you for doing so. And we thank you, Audible, again, for being a sponsor of our fledgling podcast. Okay, let's, as we say, not waste any more time. Here is Terry Hanson in our conversation about his early days as an executive in the fledgling North American Soccer League. Give a listen. Well, I first of all, I thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you've got to get up early. You've got a real regular radio show to deal with, and I think most people may know, well, a lot of people down in the South and the southwestern part of the country may know you as a regular on The Big Show with John Boy and Billy. But we know you, Terry Hanson, as someone, and we've discovered through mutual acquaintances a dark past in a world that's important to us in our little podcast here, and that's your exploits in the old North American Soccer League. And you didn't say no to a conversation, so I guess some of the scars are still not fully healed. But I'd love to delve with your history a little bit about some of your times in the NASL, if you don't mind regaling us with some of those stories.
Well, be my guest, sir.
Okay, well, I guess the first place to kind of start is at the start. How did you even get enmeshed in the fledgling North American Soccer League? I guess this is somewhere in the mid-'70s, right, where I guess your first taste was with the Lancers of Rochester, correct?
It was. I was a college soccer and baseball coach, and my career goal was to work in pro sports, namely in professional Major League Baseball. And I was a college soccer and baseball coach, like I said, but I was really a baseball coach first. And they told me that when I coached baseball, they asked me if I wanted to coach soccer, and I had never played. And I said that that really didn't interest me. And then they told me that, well, the soccer coach is also going to be the baseball coach in this college. And I said, well, then I'd be happy to do it. So that was back in like 1970, 71. So I hadn't played, and I really didn't know the game very well. So I had to set myself out to learn the game of soccer without having played by getting myself close to assistant coaches that I hired. I knew I could recruit, and I knew I could organize and motivate a team, but I needed to learn the game. So one of my players was drafted to Rochester, New York, to the Lancers, and he called me, my player, and said, they're looking for somebody to work here in the front office. And I said, no kidding. I said, put my name in the hat. So he did. His name was Keith Cordy. He was a defender, and they called me, and I went up for a visit. And, I guess I should have known something was up, because the day I had my meeting, I came out of my hotel room, and the guy next door to me had died during the night. They were lugging him out on a stretcher. So I don't know if there was some sort of a foreboding or anything, but it started out to be pretty weird.
Well, was this the guy you were ostensibly supposed to be replacing?
No.
Oh, that would have been even
not
more
at all.
ominous.
It was just a guy in the hotel room next to me.
Oh, okay. Nothing to do with the team. Okay, that's good.
Not at all.
Now, and where were you at the time geographically, and what year was this circa?
It was about 1975, and I had been coaching college soccer and baseball since 1970. At that time, it was called St. Benedict's College in Atchison, Kansas. Later to be called Benedictine College.
Sure.
Not like St. Procopius up in the Chicago area, but Benedictine in Kansas. And I went to school there, and I went away to get my master's, and they hired me back to come coach baseball and soccer. So I wanted to get into pro sports pretty badly. Like I said, I wanted to get to baseball. So this job opportunity presented itself in Rochester, and kind of flying up blind and not knowing much about the league or Rochester as a team, I jumped right into it with both feet.
Well, you wouldn't have been the first person, especially in that heyday of the 70s, especially when there was just fledgling sports leagues and teams and all kinds of ventures popping up all over the place. What were your first impressions, and when did you start to question your sanity once you finally got in?
Well, I think in a way, Tim, that ignorance is bliss. I mean, I came from a small Catholic college with a budget that was almost next to nothing, and I had a success in soccer there. So I said I never played, but in 1974, I was the National Collegiate Coach of the Year in the NAIA. So I did something correct over the years. So I took this job in Rochester, And I come, I say, out of a Catholic college with very little budget, so I really didn't understand how bad things really were. I mean, we didn't have a hell of a lot of money. The front office was undergunned and understaffed, and I was brought in to do, get this, public relations, marketing, team personnel for the U.S. players, traveling secretary, and also a radio announcer. So I was wearing a few hats in that gig.
Well, okay. So can you kind of give us a little bit of a taste of the franchise at that time? I mean, obviously, before you had come, it had been a pretty solid franchise in the previous, at the time, the American Soccer League, and in many respects, coming into the NASL in the early part of the 70s, actually helped, in many respects, help save the league, the NASL, that is, from extinction when it had gone down to, 5 teams in 1971. So,
right.
How popular was the team then? I know Hollander Stadium had been sort of recently renamed, and was it a popular thing in Rochester? And how did you find your efforts? Were you going uphill in terms of trying to get people to come see the team and its on field and off field kind of performance?
Well, my job basically is, and I took the job as PR initially, and that's what I thought I'd be doing, was to sell this team to the community, to radio and television, and the newspapers. And they were in the mode those years, back in the mid 70s. They would have a season, then they would blow things up and start all over again the following season. So when I got there, we had a new coach, Dragan Popovic. He was brand new. I was brand new. And he was bringing in all different players than from the year before. A few of the Americans were holdovers, but basically an entire new team was being put into place. So my job in PR, I was, selling such household names as Momčilo Stojanovic, Branko Radovic, Nikola Mijatovic, Blagoje Trmendic, and people like that to the media, which was a tough sell. And I remember telling Popovic, Dragan, one day, I said, Dragan, your name is now Don. And Momčilo Stojanovic, I said, your name is now Mike. And I kind of went from there to try to Americanize these guys a little bit.
That's fascinating. So you are responsible basically for Americanizing at least the first names of, frankly, some names that were quite legendary as the years went on, both outdoor and indoor, right?
Yeah, I did. I remember calling Dragan Don one day, and he goes, who is this Don? I said, it's you. So we went on from there. But and language is a problem as well, because not only are these guys' names hard to pronounce, most of them didn't speak the language very well. So trying to set up newspaper interviews as well as TV interviews with them was next to impossible. But we tried our best.
Well, so with Don Popovic coming in, that was for the 76 season, or was that 75?
It was a 76 season.
Okay, so that, and based on my knowledge, I guess, of the team, that was actually the first time that they, in 76, they actually made the playoffs for the first time in quite some, in a bunch of years. So clearly there was something going on with Popovic and his, I guess, selection or finding of various players to perform on the field, no?
He brought in a good team. I mean, a lot of the Yugoslavian players had played overseas and had done very well. So basically, it was some Americans, and it was had to have 3 on the field at one time. So had some guys from Brockport State, and Jim May and Kevin Gannon and Nelson Capello, and so the mix of the American players, along with some of these guys from overseas, had a pretty good team actually. And one of the big challenges, like I said, was to sell them to the press. And there was a local TV guy there by the name of Richard Funke, who ended up being a part of the New York State Legislature in latter years. And I told him I needed to have some people interviewed. And, of course, he would come out to practice, and he would interview all the American players because the other guys couldn't speak the language. And then Popovic, who spoke enough language to know what was going on and could get up in my ear pretty well, was a little upset by that. So I remember having him come out, and I remember saying to Funky, look, you've got to interview the foreign players. And he said, well, they can't speak the language, and what do you want me to do? And I said, well, I don't care if you've got filming the camera or not. Just go ahead and interview them. And then after that, we'll have to talk to some of the American players, and then you can run your piece. So I remember after a couple of weeks, Popovich asked me where all the interviews were. And I said, well, they put those in the can. They'll use them at another time. And I remember him telling the players that they've got these interviews somewhere in a container, is what he called them. And I got away with that for about a half a year.
Well, Rochester was an interesting franchise in the NASL in that it was almost like the Green Bay Packers of that league. I mean, granted, the NASL, not the paradigm of stability per se, but by contrast, Rochester was quite stable, at least as a perpetual franchise throughout all of the 1970s. But clearly, probably the smallest market of all the teams in that league.
And our budget was next to nothing. We had an owner in John Ficosi who really minded his P's and Q's with his money, and we didn't have many resources at all. And so trying to spend money on marketing and public relations was impossible. But again, I didn't know any better. So I basically, we didn't have any money to spend. So I basically made do with what I had. And, the problem with the team was that they also knew that we didn't spend a lot of money on players, so Popovich had to be very resourceful. And he was. And the city, I can't tell you that it was a great sports town, and there was a certain pocket of fans that were mostly Italian, and some were Yugoslavian, but mostly Italian fans. So we had a good solid base of around 5,000 or 6,000, and that put us in Hollander Stadium about halfway full, I guess. So the atmosphere was okay. But again, like I said, I didn't know any better. I mean, I was new to all of this, and I was just happy I was in pro sports.
Now, you didn't stay in Rochester for long, though, because you went to Washington, the Diplomats, relatively soon thereafter, correct?
Well, yeah, right when the season was over, they quit paying me.
There is that, huh?
And that'll get your attention pretty quickly. So what they had done in the past years was they had just basically run the season and then not paid a lot of their bills and then incorporated into another company the following year and gone from year to year that way. So when the season was over, they quit paying me, and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to find another job, I guess. And the good thing about working in Rochester was that the league expectations from us was very low in terms of administratively and doing things according to the league office, etc. And I went in there and I did all that stuff very well. So I had a pretty high profile, and a lot of people knew who I was. So when the season was over, I thought to myself, well, I'm going to have some opportunities, I hope. And I started sending out letters and trying to make contacts. And John Carbray was hired to be the general manager of the Washington Diplomats. And he had been in AAA baseball and had been the executive of the year. And again, I go back to baseball. I wrote him a note when he came to the league and congratulated him. And I said it was good to see somebody that had been in baseball come to soccer because that was where I came from. And he called me, I guess right after he got the letter, and said, look, I'm looking for a PR director. Would you be interested? And I said, well, of course I would be interested. And by the time I said yes, and by the time I got there, I also had inquiries from the Cosmos, as well as the New England. They weren't the team then yet. I can't remember the name of what their name was at that time.
Boston Minutemen.
Yes. But you know what? Maybe it was. Do you know what year they became the team in?
I think that was 78 is when they were the team.
Okay, but I can't remember who called me to go up there, but I went up there for an interview as well as the Cosmos. And I liked the opportunity in Washington because, here we go again, the owners in Washington were going to bring the San Diego Padres to D.C., and at the 11th hour, Ray Kroc, a fellow from the Chicago area there, rescued the team and kept them in San Diego. So I ended up going to to Washington because of Carberry and his baseball background, and because of the ownership situation there. So I went, and I was the PR director for the 1977 season. I got there at the end of 76.
So you walked into probably a little bit more of a stable environment there. And if I have my stats correctly, in 77, the Diplomats went from, I don't know, I think their average attendance was something like in 76 was just shy of 6,000. And according to the stats that I see here, 77, it doubled to about 13,000.
Carberry was a master promoter. That's where he got his chops in minor league baseball. And he brought gimmicks to the table. We would paint the field. I don't know if you ever saw that in any aerial shots, but it was a soccer ball with red and black, and the whole field was painted. And he just had all kinds of promotional ideas. And we hired an ad agency, which was unknown, which was something that a lot of teams weren't able to do. And ownership had put a lot of money behind the team. So, yeah, it was a much more stable situation. My office is at RFK Stadium, and that's where we played games, so I kind of felt like I had hit the big leagues.
How did you find the Washington, D.C. Soccer public and your ability to sell and market and do all the things that you ostensibly started to do in Rochester? Was it easier and or maybe more visible because you're in a more metropolitan area?
Well, you're right about the metropolitan area. There were a lot of people that knew the game, and there was always the the fringe part of the immigrants who followed the game. A lot of different ones in that melting pot up in D.C. But there was a small rift for whatever reason between some of the youth soccer leagues and the pro team there. So we had to go to work and kind of sell ourselves to the Annandale Boys Club and to a Springfield Soccer Association, and a lot of those teams that I'm not saying that the past teams alienated themselves, but I will say that the relations when I got there and we got there were not the best. So we always had our selling shoes on, and I went from not really understanding PR and not having worked in it before to now I was dealing with the Washington Post, and our beat writer was John Feinstein.
Sure.
And so that I was growing up learning the PR business with the Washington Post. And as I said, the ownership gave us resources. So it was a pretty good ride. And we got started with our coach was Dennis Violet, who was a legend in his own right. And so things were going pretty good that first year.
What was your perception of the league at that point? I mean, obviously you said somewhat lowered expectations in Rochester, and I'm sure as the league got more popular, expanded to 24 teams eventually, the whole national television thing, which we can talk about in a few minutes. But did you get the sense that this league was on its ascendancy and perhaps was maybe you were really onto something by now being with a team that's not only more stable, but the league itself seems to be gaining more roots and more stability, at least interest? Nationwide.
Yeah, we were getting a lot of interest. The national marketing dollars started to flow towards the league and some to the clubs. Pele was big in New York. The Cosmos were kind of at the height of their ascendance there. With Kinali was coming on board. Pele was there. They were playing in the Meadowlands. I was there the night they broke the record. I think we had 78,000 people or something up there in the game, and I happened to be there at that game. So it was a fun ride. But going back to what I initially said, I had never been in any other leagues, and I really had nothing to compare it to. So it was all good for me. And but the league itself was really starting to get a foothold in the American culture, and it was fun to be around and fun to watch.
The Diplomats also played indoors too. Did you? I suspect that you had to kind of stop gears and try to now pitch the indoor game too at the old Armory, right?
Yeah, we did. And one of the big jobs I had was going out and finding a field and getting boards to come in from hockey. And that was a kind of a good gargantuan effort because we had to start from scratch. and ended up going up to Delaware to look for a carpet up there that somebody had had. Of all people, Andy Dolich put me onto somebody up there. He was, that time was in the hockey league with the Washington Capitals. So I had to go find a carpet and buy it, and the Washington Capitals put me onto a guy who had boards. So we had to go out and start the whole thing. The challenge, quite frankly, for me at that time was more operational than it was PR-wise, is we had to put a team on the field in the Armory, which we had never played indoor before in that building.
Well, I got to think that the Armory, venerable as that structure is, and it's at the time was probably not your first choice to play indoor soccer during the winter, right?
It wasn't. It was in a bad part of the city. Of course, it was right across the street from RFK. So we figured if we could draw to RFK, we could draw to the Armory. And with the people who were in hockey in that town, we thought there'd be some crossover. And there was. But one of the things I remember most about that season was our goalkeeper was Eric Martin, and he broke his leg in an indoor game. And all the players from overseas saw the indoor game as nothing but a gimmick, and they were out there to play and have fun. They weren't out there to get hurt. So we had some of our foreign players weren't too pleased with the effort. They didn't like indoor that much, and we had a sales job to do on our players as much as we did the fans.
In terms of the crowds there, having grown up as a Cosmos fan myself, as a little tyke in the northern New Jersey area, and having season tickets there, and going to a few away games, obviously, if memory serves, a lot of the sellouts or your largest crowds, I suspect, were Cosmos related. Is that a fair statement?
Around the league, I think that'd be a fair statement.
Sure.
One of the issues I kind of always had, and I was not schooled in marketing or PR. I've been in education though, but I knew enough to know that I would rather have 12,000 people wanting to get into a 10,000 seat stadium than 15,000 to go into a 40,000 seat stadium. So RFK, we had decent crowds, but it was only a third of the stadium, and the ambiance wasn't very good. And around the league, I mean, a lot of teams around the league were doing the same thing in bigger stadiums. Chicago was doing that. One of the few people who really understood and got it was Fort Lauderdale, because they were in Lockhart Stadium when they moved to Fort Lauderdale from Miami, and it was kind of a smaller stadium, and the ambiance they had was really very good. And now Tampa had a bigger stadium as well. But their promotion, they were just years ahead of everybody. So the job the Rowdies did and the job that they did in Fort Lauderdale were things that we kind of tried to pattern ourselves after. And then out on the West Coast, Seattle was doing a good job with Jack Daly and those guys as well.
Yeah, well, it's clearly that's what bedeviled the launch of pro soccer in the late '60s here in this country as well, right? You had baseball owners and a few NFL owners, I believe, and playing in these big stadiums, and were kind of just crushed when 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 people were rattling around a 50,000, 60,000 seat stadium, and it took until Major League Soccer to kind of get to that soccer specific template to kind of.
I'll jump ahead a little bit and get to Atlanta for a second,
please.
We had a big stadium there of around 40,000, and we had about 3,000 or 4,000 people rattling around in there. And one night, though, the ball kicked into the stands, and get this, nobody could find the ball. Nobody could find where the ball went, because it went into a section of stands where nobody was sitting, and they just couldn't find it.
Now, this is the
I
old.
think eventually they found it, but for about 5 or 10 minutes, they couldn't find the ball.
Well, yeah, it's an expensive ball, right? $67 at the time, and a collector's item now, of course. But we're talking about the old Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, correct? The multi-purpose gem that was there for quite some time. All right, let's talk about how you got to Atlanta, because that seems like a nice big fat story in and of itself, given your ownership and all that. But how did you? Was the Washington Diplomats experience more of a visibility thing for you, and that somehow garnered the attraction of the fledgling Atlanta franchise?
Well, when I was in Washington as the PR director the first year and assistant GM the second year, And both years I did television. I did the color analysis on the games. And I really enjoyed doing that. And it was kind of unique to have a front office person working in a booth, I guess. But I kind of went forward. I worked with John Miller, the ESPN guy, for a year. In the second year, and a guy named Don Earl the first year, who had been in hockey with the Philadelphia Flyers. And I knew that Turner was going to buy a team and come into the league, and I really had given it not much thought. Although I did, again, baseball. I mean, I knew that he owned the Braves, and it turned out that one night Ted Turner was in in Washington, and he had bought a team for TV purposes, for programming, and he'd seen me do a game, and he liked what he saw, and he had a fellow by the name of Dick Cecil was running the operation there, and Dick had done his own research and found out what I was all about and what I could do and not do. So I got a call from Dick Cecil asking me if I'd be interested in coming to Atlanta. And I thought, I was really excited about that because of the Braves angle. And I'd never been down south, other than I was living in suburban Virginia, but I had really not been to the deep south, down in Georgia. And I thought it might be something I'd like to do, so I went down for a visit, and I liked what I saw. I really enjoyed the being around the Hawks and the Braves at the same time. Turner was charming, and it didn't take much of a sell for me to go and make the move there for the I went in 1978 for the 79 season.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. Now, for those diligent soccer historians, and we do have a few, more than a few that do listen to this show, and the soccer episodes tend to be pretty popular, and this may be one of the reasons why. But Atlanta was not an expansion franchise; it was actually acquired from another location and relocated it, I believe.
Colorado,
right?
Yeah,
right.
The Colorado Caribou.
And I'm shocked that the Chiefs would not keep the Caribou uniforms that the players used the year before.
With the buckskin, didn't they have buckskin or something like that?
They did, and the fringe. If you don't remember, there was I forget who the and I'm sorry I'm blanking on this, but there was a high end fashion designer who put those together. But there was they were regarded as they looked like they were half uniforms, and then on the bottom there was these fringe elements that would just fly up and down, and it was quite something. But I
remember seeing those. I remember seeing those, and I remember they were butt ugly. I remember that, and I'm glad they didn't bring that feature to Atlanta.
But I got to tell you, though, that the Chiefs uniforms I thought were actually quite standout. I thought they were bold and they were yet tasteful. I thought the Chiefs logo was quite good. Did you have a hand in any of that stuff?
I did not. It was all Cecil, who had also been he started the first Atlanta Chiefs version 1. He had been a vice president with the Braves, and he was in charge of all stadium activities that weren't the Braves. So he was with the Braves as a vice president, and then left the organization, but stayed involved with booking other things into the stadium. And then he had the Chiefs won there. So then he decided that he wanted to get another soccer team in Atlanta, and went to Turner and sold him on the idea. So the uniforms and the logo were basically a rendition of what they had in the earlier days when Phil Woosnam was the coach.
So why do you think Cecil, because obviously Cecil was part of the original Chiefs franchise and obviously, part of the league in its most, dark days, obviously hiring Phil Woosnam at the time paid off in spades. Why do you think Cecil decided to somehow get back into the game again, so to speak, with the second incarnation?
Well, he was a visionary. And I think he understood that soccer, he felt that soccer was going to be the next big, great sport. And that he was in the business of promoting and in the business of putting other events in stadiums. And he was a fan of the game. And he just had a feeling that he could sell Ted on the idea of TV programming for soccer, as well as being able to sell it into Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. So that's kind of what his vision was. And, and he was far ahead of his time, because look at what's happening there now in Atlanta. But, he gave it his best shot, and we went down there with a lot of hopes and a lot of money to spend. Turner gave us, when I came to town, he introduced me as the general manager, as well as the color analyst on the games. And he said I was like buying a suit with 2 pair of pants. And about a week later, I was in the stadium club having lunch with a member of the Braves front office who was in charge of all the radio broadcasts. And Turner walked through and he said to the guy, I was sitting there, didn't even acknowledge me. He said to the guy, so how are things going with the Braves in the radio? And the guy told him, he said, and the Hawks. And he says, well, they got this and that going, and they got this sold and that. And he said, and the Cougars? And the guy said, who? He said, the Cougars. And the guy said, you mean the Chiefs? And he said, oh, yeah, whatever. And then he stuck his hand out to me and he said, hi, I'm Ted Turner. I mean, he had forgotten me in a week. And he called the team the Cougars. So Ted had a great vision for the team and having it on television, but he was not a guy for great detail at the time.
Well, okay, so was that indicative of his quote-unquote interest in the sport, or was he largely convinced by Cecil to kind of really do it and just thought it would be an add-on to an already strong sports, component of his organization?
Well, much like the Braves, he saw a stadium as a TV studio, and he really wanted something TV programming. He thought soccer would be one of the next great things to be on his network. And like he did with the Braves as the kind of the model, he bought the team, and he did the same thing with the Hawks. He wanted to put them on the air and own them at the same time. So he saw the opportunity of getting involved in soccer and owning a team and putting them on television. And for him, attendance in the stadium was gravy. So we were playing with the house cards for a while, but the problem was that our TV ratings weren't very good either, and neither was the team.
All right, let's talk about that, because for those who might remember, circa 78, 79, that was the era of in cable television, which was really starting to take root. I think ESPN had come on the scene fairly recently. You had a number of super stations, right? And the term was actually coined by Ted, right? And one of the, right, if not the most powerful one, was out of Atlanta, right? And that was effectively a national broadcast, and it was one of the only real ways to see on a regular basis NASL soccer until ABC came on the scene to do their national games and an occasional TVS game prior to that. But what was that like? I mean, you had a fairly extensive schedule of games that you were doing with your colleague Bob Neal, right?
We did. I think we just did just about every game. And there's been a quote over the years attributed to me that was mistaken. I never faulted TV for not having a good attendance. I think that was a Dan Wood quote that I somehow got ascribed to me, because I always kind of got and understood the idea that we were a TV company who had a soccer team. So we were basically, the Superstation concept was a local TV station who happened to be taken on satellite around the country. So we were basically owned and operated by a local broadcaster, which was Turner Broadcasting, and they just put the satellite up around the country. And when I got there, we were going into about 14 to 16 states. And at that time, that's what we were doing. And soccer, was we thought going to be really big. And we had Bob Neal and I kind of had a little bit of a cult following. And the thing that I think I brought to the party as a broadcaster, I had to learn the game. And I was late to the party in learning the game. And a lot of times people, unless they were part of the community that had played soccer growing up and come from other countries or something, people were learning the game as well. And I think I could probably explain the game because I just learned it myself to newcomers. And so we would talk about what the offside rule was and things of that sort for people who were just trying to learn the game at the same time. I think maybe some of the veterans of the game were maybe a little frustrated with us, but that was not the majority of our audience.
Well, I also think too, you have to put it in the times, right? I mean, that you had a league that was obviously growing by leaps and bounds, and there was a lot of fervor and interest in it, especially in New York and Tampa and some of these other markets we mentioned before. And look, ABC, I think, even did a less good job of that, right? When Jim McKay and Paul Gardner, who's been on our show about a month and a half ago, he explained that there was a balance there, right? You had the audience was basically comprised of two sets of substantial number of people, which is those who are familiar with the game and want to get to the nuances, and probably a bigger majority of others who are relatively new and more curiosity seeking. And, they don't understand offsides, et cetera. I look, having seen some old clips and from what I remember of the old TBS broadcasts, watching as a snotty young kid in northern New Jersey on my cable box, it felt like it was, I think you gave more credit to the audience than maybe you were sort of, than you're sort of giving yourself credit for.
Well, that's good to hear. I was just operating on instinct. And Bob Neal had been a football announcer. And he never had been around soccer himself. So my job was to be both the color analyst, general manager of the team, and also teaching Bob Neal the game. So the first game that we ever did was the first game he'd ever done. And I was trying to teach him as we went along. And again, it was easy to teach him because I just learned the game myself in the last 5 to 8 years. And so we kind of went into it blind, but I go back to what I said initially about Rochester. Ignorance is bliss. I really didn't know what type of a mountain we were trying to climb all those years. It was just fun to be around and fun to be around the game and around the growth of the game. And Neal and I really enjoyed ourselves. But, we were putting a product on the field to sell to a TV audience, and the product wasn't very good.
Obviously, being part of a television-centric organization, did you ever find yourself kind of, stumbling, or how about missing a goal? Right? Did you ever find situations where you broke away for a commercial, right? Which is, common, and coming back and having a goal scored, and how do you handle something like that?
Certainly that happened. And although I have to say, you see the other thing is we didn't score that often on the road. But yeah, we had faced a lot of different challenges, but they're basically the people doing our games had been Braves and Hawks production people. So like everything else at that point in time, they were learning as we went along as well. So I was calling the commercial breaks in the booth, because I could tell when the ball was going out of bounds and when it would be a corner kick and when play would be paused for a little bit. So I basically had a key cue that I would use to the truck, and they break the commercials that way.
Interesting. So do you remember, did you broadcast home games as well, or just the away games? Because I'm sure that was a contentious conversation as to whether you should broadcast home games, correct?
Well, the Braves had set the model. They televised all their games. And I can't remember specifically. I know we did all the road games. And I think we must have done maybe half of the home games. And it wasn't for a desire for Ted not to do all of them. I think we probably had a sales issue with selling so many of them on air. But I know we did all the road games and a portion of the home games. And like I said, over the years I've had a quote that I blamed attendance on the TV, and nothing could be further from the truth. Because I knew that we had a soccer team in Atlanta because of television, not in spite of it.
Yeah, that's a unique perspective, because I think the reigning thought at that time in American sports was, and the blackout rule, the NFL, et cetera, is that, broadcasting home games is the ultimate downer to the gate, right? But you weren't working for any traditional team per se. You were working for a company that was very much on the cutting edge of television.
And I got that early on. And because initially I went in there and I thinking about the Braves, and they're not drawing anybody. But Ted could care less what was in the stadium, as long as the TV numbers were good, and as long as the games were going around the country. I mean, at that point in time, Braves were America's team, and he was betting on soccer was going to be the next big thing to happen, and he was going to own a team and have the TV rights for it. So yeah, it was cutting edge. And ironically, I ended up being the first head of the sports division after soccer ended. So I always got the concept of what it was, and it helped me grow into a job over there where I was the first head of sports for Turner Broadcast.
You talked about the team before. Obviously, not great, especially in '79 and '80. But in '79, though, there was a unique little asterisk in the NASL, and that was a players' strike of all things, right? A league that's fledgling, 24 markets, a new, national television contract, and all of a sudden there's labor strife and there's a strike.
Yeah.
Do you remember any of those sort of components? Because if I'm not mistaken, I think the Chiefs and the team, I guess, opted not to strike while others in the league did. And it was just chaos, I think, in terms of what was on the field and frankly, what fans actually knew was going on.
It was chaotic. And if memory serves me correct, when I was in D.C., is when they kind of started to do the formation of the union, because it was the NFL Players Association. It was the people who were in charge of it. And it was a guy by the name of Ed Garvey who wanted to organize soccer like he did football. He also was betting on the fact that soccer was going to be the next big thing. And we released a player by the name of John Kerr from Washington, and Garvey picked him up to work full-time for the Players Association. Then I made a move to Atlanta, and that's when the union really became a little bit stronger. And we didn't have a tremendous amount of people visiting us from the Players Association down in Atlanta. And early on, Turner, he kind of found out about it, and he had fought off for years people wanting to come in and organize the TV networks. So I remember him having a discussion with us and then the players, saying, "Look, I'll treat you guys good. I mean, you don't have to have a union for me to treat you well. I do that to all my employees." So he said, "My best advice to you would be, I would not get too involved with the union if I were you, and don't forget I'm writing the checks." So it wasn't a threat, but it was a statement that he got out ahead of the curve a little bit, and talked to the players and the front office staff, and that's why they opted out and decided not to join the union.
But am I correct in that the team was one of that they opted not to honor the strike? That's
correct.
And so
my memory gets a little hazy, but I do know that we opted out of the strike and did not participate.
Very interesting. I mean, obviously it didn't make much of a difference in terms of the outdoor season of the performance that year, and then obviously the year following. All right, but let's talk about one other little interesting little twist about this team. And we talked about indoors before in your travels with the Diplomats, but ironically, it looks like that the Chiefs actually drew better and actually performed better indoors at the Omni than they did outdoors.
That was unbelievable.
How does that happen?
Well, I think we had a pretty good marketing apparatus in place with Ken Small, who we brought in from the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. And I thought he was always fell victim to the fact in outdoor soccer that we didn't have the correct ambiance. I mean, I think, he could have been a marketing genius anywhere. But when you've got 4,000 people in a 45,000 seat stadium, you're not going to have any ambiance, and nor excitement was going to get built. So he was able to, on promotional vehicles, were kind of able to get into play more in indoor. And there was a big hockey town at the time, and the Atlanta Flames had just left in hockey. So there was an audience that kind of wanted to see things in the Omni that weren't basketball. And we had name recognition, and indoor soccer to new fans was more exciting than at least the version of the outdoor game we played. It was more exciting. And so we got our ad agency on board. They got very active with selling the team. We did well at the outset, and the crowds kept building. And it was a lot of fun. In fact, there was a big rumor that we were going to leave the NASL and join the MISL at the end of our existence, which we never did do. But it would have made perfect sense.
Very interesting. I did not know that they were one of the teams that might have actually made that jump.
Well, it was logical because we kind of were one of the teams that did so much better. You just mentioned it in indoor as opposed to outdoor. And I don't remember that we were actually being courted by the MISL, but I remember Ed Tepper, and I can't remember the other guy's name at the time who was in charge of the MISL.
Earl Foreman.
But they had some conversations with us. They wanted to have our superstation as well. But at the end of the day, I think Turner just decided to get enough of soccer, and when we closed on the NASL team, we shut down everything.
Well, all right. So let's talk about that because you were. It seems like you were not able to draft that attendance success from that first indoor season to the next. I think actually the team outdoors in '79 was the least attended of all the teams in the league at that point. No,
I think they were. I think we announced something like 4,000 a game, and I can't tell you that even that many were in the stands. And I think also, if you look at the record, I think the first year we were like, I don't know what, 14 and 18 or something. And that year, second year, I think we were like 7 and 25 or something like that.
That's right.
And so the team wasn't very exciting. There wasn't very much ambiance, and the attendance was just woeful. And I think you're correct. I think we did bottom out at the bottom of the league as to what our attendance was. And I always felt, in spite of the fact I knew we were a TV company, I always felt that we had a handicap by playing in Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. I rather would have been in a place like Lockhart Stadium had in Fort Lauderdale, where we had enough ambiance the way we kind of did in the indoor. And in indoor, we kind of created that ambiance. We had that excitement, and we could never have that spark in Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. And I think maybe our biggest crowd of all 3 years I was there was, I don't know, maybe 14,000, 15,000. And that, of course, was for a Pele game.
Was there any discussion of perhaps finding another location, perhaps Bobby Dodd Stadium? Obviously, you've got a team in Atlanta now that is, a part of the NFL thing, but it's sellout crowds at Bobby Dodd. Or was that a non-issue considering Turner's ownership of the Braves and its relationship with the Atlanta Fulton County?
Well, Dick Cecil's vision was it would be in Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, and he was tough. He was a tough sell. And because he was in charge of something called Braves Productions Inc., which is really where he got the soccer team underneath that umbrella that he was the promoter of. So I mean, I had to try to convince him to go somewhere small. And ironically, the last game we ever played outdoor when I was there was in a 12,000 seat stadium called DeKalb County Stadium out in DeKalb County, around Decatur area. that was a high school football stadium. And of all people, we played Fort Lauderdale. And I believe we might have put, I can't tell you exactly what the attendance was, but we were close to a full attendance. And that was the one piece of ambiance that I was always looking for, and it was our last game.
You know, it's interesting, too, because as you stumbled through the 80 season and then went back to indoors, I mean, you went from the least attended outdoor team in the North American Soccer League to the most attended indoor team that next winter.
Our agency had kind of positioned us in the marketplace as something to do where you had to be. The young jet-setting crowd should be there. It was full of good times, and we had all kinds of crazy promotions. We brought in, remember Slim Whitman?
Of course.
The guy, we brought him in for a concert. We had all kinds of ideas. We were marketing to the Georgia Tech crowd. We were marketing to a kind of a young single crowd downtown Atlanta. And then we always had that base of soccer fans that we had out in DeKalb County and out in Cobb County that were still coming. But where we really kind of hit pay dirt was in that younger upper mobile audience that just liked to have some action.
All right. Well, so maybe we could just jump ahead to the 81 season, right? Because that's when did you know the gig was up? I mean, obviously a lot of seeds and maybe, you know, we're kind of laid bare and we're, you know, based on what I've read, it sounded like that Turner kind of gave the organization and the league kind of an ultimatum that this was, you know, going into the third outdoor season was kind of be the last sort of chance, I guess, so to speak, to kind of get it right. And there seemed to be a couple of sort of glimmers of hope. I mean, the team obviously did much better. It was in the playoffs for the first time ever outdoors, but it still wasn't nearly enough. Now, was it?
Yeah, Chadwick turned around the team the best he possibly could. I think that was the first winning year, or the only winning year we had in the three. And we knew that our time was limited. And I remember one time waking up on a Sunday morning and seeing a big newspaper article in the Atlanta Constitution, and there was a quote in there from Turner. And the article was also a kind of a little bit of the header next to his picture. And he said the Chiefs had one foot on the expressway and another on the banana peel. And I'll never forget that quote. And I thought to myself, oh, goodness, I better get the resume ready because I don't know what I'll be doing when the season's over. So, yeah, we knew that the third year was probably going to be our last. And we tried our best, and it was kind of a last-ditch effort for me to get the team in a smaller stadium. But that wasn't going to work because it wasn't a part of the infrastructure of Turner Broadcasting in the big stadium owning the Braves and at that time being the primary tenant within Fulton County Stadium. So we went into that last year knowing it was probably it.
And at what point during the season did you kind of know? I mean, was it going into the playoffs? I mean, was it kind of a fait accompli? It really didn't matter. I mean, was there a point literally in that season when you kind of just knew that it was not going to happen, or was it kind of decided kind of at the end of the season?
Well, I think on the business side over on Techwood, which is where the corporate offices were versus where we were in the stadium, we just tried to keep hope alive, and didn't get too much into the business side of the operation, at least from the team side. I mean, I was aware because of Wussler, who was my boss, who reported to Turner, so I reported to Robert Wussler and Ted. So I knew that the jig was probably going to be up. But the players were, you know, they thought that if they could win and have a winning season, and maybe draw up better crowds, that there was a chance. And we were not about to tell them there wasn't a chance because Turner could be so you know, he could be so off the cuff. Maybe he would get excited about something and would decide to keep the team for another year. So we all went into the latter part of the season hoping, beyond hope, that we'd have a future. But I think deep down, I mean, at least me, I knew kind of deep down that was probably going to be it.
Well, it did serve you well, though, right? I mean, a segue into a television broadcasting career in sports, and obviously from a place that, you know, obviously was birthing quite a bit of it in the modern form. I guess the one last question I'd ask you about sort of the last days of the Chiefs, and I've seen this speculated, but maybe you could sort of address it, is I get the suspicion that Ted and the organization were both distracted by their new baby, the CNN cable news network?
Well, they didn't give us too much attention from the get-go. I mean, we were pretty much left on our own to run that team. So I can't necessarily say that because of CNN and everything else, it took anything away from soccer. He kind of always ran a separate organization. I know that my bosses in Whistler and Ted were otherwise occupied with the explosive growth of the company, but it really didn't affect the soccer team that much.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seemed like that was also the time when you had a bunch of corporate investors that had come into the league circa 78, 79, 80, like Madison Square Garden, for example, the Washington Diplomats. And it seemed like a pretty quick exit again. And it seemed like it was kind of pretty much almost the thing to do, if you will, from a corporate ownership perspective, kind of throwing in the towel. But, well, I mean, there had to be some fun times, though. No, in all of that, both Atlanta as well as your other two stops. I mean, was it a good learning environment, at least? I mean, obviously, you said you didn't know any better. I got to think, though, that there had to be some hijinks or at least some lessons learned that prepared you well for your Renaissance career afterwards in media and entertainment.
Well, I was excited just to be there from the day that I got in town in Rochester until the last game in Atlanta. I mean, it was pro sports. And it was something I always wanted to do, and it was a lot more money and budget than I ever had when I was coaching. And every year I made a move from a team that there's a little bit more available to us for resources. I was leaving Washington right when Madison Square Garden was coming in. So we at that time we were still owned by the Danzansky family. The Madison Square Garden was just buying the team when I was leaving, and I got to Turner. So it was exciting times, and I met great people, had a lot of good friends I still have today. It was fun. We had a great camaraderie amongst all of us in the league, executives. Team league meetings and all the guys I got to know there, and all the teams that got together when they would come to town. So we had a wonderful time. Made some great friends. And like I said, it was pro sports, and for me, it was just the cherry on the topping for me, and I just enjoyed the hell out of it the whole time I was there.
Did you ever think, though, that given sort of the demise of your involvement, the organization's involvement with pro soccer, and your ride through it during much of the 70s, did you ever think that it could come back sort of in a reincarnated form like it is today in Major League Soccer, and I think a fledgling minor league system as well here in the United States?
We kept waiting for it to happen. We were marketing our butt off, and we went to all the youth teams, and that was all three markets I was in. We went to the youth teams. We went to the hotbeds of soccer and participation. But one of the things that I became aware of, I think, along the way was that participation did not necessarily translate into spectatorship. That you had soccer families where the kids were practicing 2 or 3 times a week and had a game or two a week, and the mothers were always at the old soccer moms. They were in a station wagon taking these kids around to practices and games, but they really weren't getting in that station wagon and headed down to the stadium on the weekends. It was a tough sell, and I know in Washington, for instance, we had what they called a youth parade before the games, where we anybody in team uniform was able to come on the field and encircle the field at the start of the game. And the idea, of course, was to get kids there, to have somebody had to bring them there, and it would be their parents, and they could be on the field in uniform. So I think the great frustration was never being able to take that youth soccer, at least when I was involved, and translate it over to be a pro audience. And that didn't happen for a long time. And I thought it was going to happen in the 80s. I really did. And then as the years wore on, I just could not quite figure it out. And I've just been so pleased to watch what's happening with the MLS. And now I got my eye on Atlanta, what's happening there. It to me, it is very rewarding to watch and see everything that's happening in the league now. And we take no pride in authorship at all. I'm sure we had a little bit to do with the city getting to know the game, but what they've done now is miraculous.
Well, it certainly is night and day. I actually do think that you're being a little under nourishing in your commentary, because I do think that there are a lot of pioneering efforts that in the North American Soccer League in particular that do resonate. I think it would be very interesting to see. I mean, like, for example, the ownership or the co-ownership of teams across different leagues to the extent that they're allowed. I mean, obviously in Atlanta, with the Atlanta United franchise, right, having the resources and the shared facility of the Falcons with the Blank family, there's significant advantages there. And in many respects, you guys were kind of the beginnings of sort of that idea. And I think it's, it would be very interesting. And I'd be curious to hear your take on this. I do see in Major League Soccer quite a bit of, fairly recently, I wouldn't call it nostalgia, but memories and remembrances to things that came beforehand. Obviously, you've got some teams in this league now that are actually the names of the teams that preceded them in the old North American Soccer League. Not the case in Atlanta, but I do see a lot of heritage being called back. And at some point, after the novelty, I think, of the United franchise in Atlanta wears off, you got to think that with the rich history that you were even part of for the 3 years of the reincarnated Chiefs franchise, with the Apollos and the original Chiefs, there's probably some throwback kinds of things there that probably will, I would hope, call you back to at least take a bow for some of those pioneering things that maybe you don't think had too much effect, but actually did.
Well, I hope so. I mean, we tried our best, and I kept waiting for it in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, and I've always been a fan ever since I got into pro soccer. I mean, became a fan more every year. I was probably one of the few people watching the World Cup in Charlotte back in the early 2000s, because I mean, I just really began to love the game, and I've watched it ever since. And I think that maybe some of the cities have. I doubt if the old Atlanta Chiefs have been called back too much by the United people, but I'm not sure that. I'm speaking that out of school because I don't know.
I'd give it some time. I think they will, but I think this year they want to just get their name, and they seem to be doing quite well just with the curiosity factor for.
Well, I'm proud of what they pulled off. I mean, that's the city I worked in, and when I saw those attendance figures, I was really happy about all that. And Arthur Blank, the funny thing was, the NFL had cross ownership problems back in the day, and in the NFL you could not own two franchises. So Joe Robbie, of course, owned the Dolphins, and he could not own the Strikers, so the owner was really Elizabeth Robbie, his wife.
Indeed.
So back in the day, the business model wouldn't have worked because the NFL wouldn't allow it.
Very interesting. All right. Well, before we let you go, Terry, I don't want to sort of speed through sort of the rest of your career, but maybe you can give our audience a bit of a sense of how you wound up on a quite successful nationally syndicated radio show years later, and still. It was a whirlwind after the Chiefs were over. I became the first head of TBS Sports, and it was a cable network. It was just going national, and I brought NCAA football there and the NBA, and I say me and a group of people, and parlayed that into an offer from the PGA Tour. Moved to Florida for 7 years and ran the communications department and production company of the PGA Tour from 84 to 91, and then in 91 came to Charlotte to be the president of Raycom Management Group of Raycom Sports. And I was lured to Charlotte with a 5-year deal. And 3 years into the 5-year deal, I started my own company. And John Boy and Billy's Big Show at that point in time was a local radio show here in Charlotte. And they became a client of mine because they were investigating syndication, and they were a client of mine as to how they might syndicate their radio network, because I knew television syndication, but I really didn't understand radio syndication that much, but it was applicable. So early on, I got involved with those guys and kind of was a part of them for a long time, and I was a consultant with them for I don't know about 15 or 20 years. And then about 10 years ago, they
they were looking for something else in the studio, and I've always been close to the operation, and I had my own company, and it was doing okay, but I wasn't getting the ball out of the park necessarily. I had a lot of clients, and they came and made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So about 10 years ago, I decided to jump over and work with them, and I'm basically the token Yankee on a Southern Redneck radio program. And it's fun. I mean, I really enjoy it. It's 6 shows a week, 4 hours a day, in about 23 states. And I do some sports, I do some media stuff, and I sit on set all the time and kind of just play with it the whole time and really enjoy myself.
And I think it keeps you young, too. I mean, obviously, you've got a lot of great background and a lot of interesting experiences. And, that's a hell of a lot of fun. I mean, I can't imagine not having fun in the morning, although I'm sure the early wake-up calls are not fun. But it does sound like you're having a hell of a lot of a good time. And look, I hope I didn't traumatize you with having to pull you back into your deep, dark, sordid history with your North American Soccer League travels. But if your audience on the radio show find out about this sort of a deep, dark past of yours, I apologize, but hopefully maybe a few will be enlightened by some of the fun and interesting and I think important things that you did back in the 70s with the old NASL.
The running joke with me on radio for my soccer background is a line that I've used a lot of times, saying that in Atlanta, we took out the turnstiles and put in a guest book. And to kind of relate how we did there, but I wouldn't be anywhere near where I am today had I not gotten that first break in soccer. I mean, the Rochester Lancers gave me my first job in pro sports, and I wouldn't be anywhere near where I am today had I not started in the North American Soccer League, and I thank the Lord that I was able to get there.
That's fantastic. Well, Terry Hanson, I can't thank you enough for being part of our little meandering of a podcast as we try to explore the things and the teams and the leagues that for whatever reason don't exist anymore. And I think you've given ample evidence as to why those stories and those travails are important, and the legacy that they've that are still, frankly, there's still the legacy that's still unfolding. Thank you very much.
Hope your listeners enjoyed listening as much as I enjoyed doing it.
Oh, I appreciate it very much, Terry, and look forward to staying connected in the months and years to come. Thank you very much, Terry Hanson.
Okay, friends. See you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Okay, there it is. There's our chat with Terry Hanson. Thank you, Terry, for allowing us to drag you back into the mid-1970s and early 1980s to remember, perhaps forcibly against your will, some of your early days in professional sports with the North American Soccer Leagues, Rochester Lancers, Washington Diplomats, and Atlanta Chiefs. As you know, Terry can be heard each and every weekday morning on The Big Show with John Boy and Billy on tons of stations all across the Southeast and the Midwest, including 105.9 The Rock in Nashville, and the flagship station for the show, 99.7 The Fox in Charlotte. That is The Big Show with John Boy and Billy. Give Terry a listen. Hell, give him a phone call during the show and tell him you heard him here on the podcast and you thought the podcast and he were tremendous. Shall you? Shall we? Okay. Thank you for doing so. In addition to that, we encourage you to please follow us on social media. We love hearing your tweets, your comments, mostly positive, please, at Good Seats Still. That's on Twitter, at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available, of course. You'll find us on Facebook. We have a page called Good Seats Still Available as well. And, of course, please indeed go to goodseatsstillavailable.com. That is the website to end all websites with relation to this show. If you missed an episode, you want to download something, you want to find a copy of a book or a video or whatever that we've referenced here on the show, that is the place to do it. You will find it and much more to come on that there website. That's goodseatsstillavailable.com. Okay, enough babbling for this week. We thank you for listening. Keep those cards and letters coming, as they say. Please tell your friends if you like the show. And we'll see you very soon on our next episode. Thank you for listening. Take care, everybody.